My name doesn't matter now. What matters is what I lived through after I said I do. When I became a wife, I thought love was about that, sharing a roof, plans, bills, and silences. Because at first, everything seemed in place. He was affectionate, present, but there were moments when his eyes drifted away, like part of him was somewhere else. And I pretended not to notice. We do that when we're afraid to lose. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't a lie. It was something else, deeper. And it took 2 years for him to show me. No fights, no tears, just a key and a sentence that shook me. This explains everything. At the time, I had no idea what I was about to discover. But if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why. That key changed everything, even the way I understand love. If this story touches something inside you, consider subscribing. Some things, only those who live them truly understand. I used to think that the real test of love came with big storms, shouting matches, ultimatums, dramatic tears. But the hardest part, no one warns you about. It's the quiet unraveling, the small, almost invisible shifts. It started with things I could easily brush off. He got home a little later than usual, meetings, delays, last-minute errands. Sometimes he'd forget to text back, or he'd fall asleep without saying goodnight. But then it became more frequent. The little things that used to connect us, coffee together in the morning, the way he'd reach for my hand without thinking, those slowly faded. I'd wake up, and he'd already be gone. I'd cook his favorite dinner, and he'd barely touch it. He was there, but he wasn't. And that's a particular kind of loneliness, when the person you love most is inches away and yet feels miles out of reach. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. In fact, I became really good at explaining things away to myself. He's just tired. Work's been crazy. Maybe I'm the one being desensitive. I clung to the idea that this was just a phase. After all, we were married now. We had made vows. We were supposed to push through. So I pushed. I tried harder. I asked how his day was, even when I could feel he didn't want to talk. I left little notes in his pockets, told him I loved him, even when his silence echoed louder than my words. And sometimes he smiled. Sometimes he seemed present. And those rare moments were enough to keep me going, to make me believe the man I married was still there somewhere. I didn't tell anyone how I felt, not even my closest friend. Because how do you explain a sadness that has no name? There was no obvious betrayal, no screaming matches, no bruises, just distance, a coldness that wasn't always there but never fully left. I started second-guessing myself constantly. Was I doing something wrong? Had I changed? Was I not enough anymore? It's strange how love can make you doubt your own reflection. I remember one night in particular. He was in the living room, scrolling on his phone. I sat across from him, just watching. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I missed him. I missed him while he was right in front of me. And I didn't know how to reach him anymore. Still, I didn't bring it up, because a part of me was afraid of what I might hear. What if he admitted he didn't feel the same? What if he wanted to leave? So instead, I stayed quiet. I told myself, love was patience, that maybe this was just a season. But deep down, I was breaking in silence. I started noticing more things. The way he avoided eye contact when I asked simple questions. How he always seemed somewhere else in his mind, like he was carrying something too heavy to share. Once, I found a small box in his car, just a plain black box with no label. When I opened it, it was empty. But even that emptiness felt like a message, like something should have been there but wasn't. I wanted to ask, but I didn't. I kept making excuses. I kept being the wife who smiled, who waited, who believed things would fall back into place on their own. I didn't realize then how much I was losing myself in the process. I started to feel like I was living in a house full of memories, not a home. Our laughter, our shared dreams, our intimacy, it all felt like echoes of something that had already happened. And yet, I never stopped loving him. That's the hardest part to admit. Even as I questioned everything, even as I felt myself slipping into a kind of quiet sadness, I didn't have words for I still loved him. I loved the idea of who we were, of who he was, before the silences. And maybe that's why I stayed, not out of weakness, but out of hope. Because I believed love could return. I believed he could come back to me. But as the days passed, I started to wonder, was he really drifting away? Or was he simply hiding something? Something he wasn't ready to share? The thought scared me, but not as much as the idea that maybe he didn't trust me enough to let me in. That was the crack I couldn't ignore, because trust is the spine of love. Without it, even the strongest heart can slowly bend, and I felt mine beginning to bend in silence. All I wanted was the truth, not the perfect version, not the rehearsed one, just his truth, raw and real. I didn't want to keep guessing, to keep wondering what I had done wrong or if this version of our marriage was now permanent. But I didn't ask, not yet. I held on a little longer, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't the truth, it's the moment right before it arrives. And mine was closer than I knew. There's a strange pain that comes from pretending not to notice what you already know deep down. And I lived inside that space for longer than I care to admit. I saw things, small, subtle signs that something wasn't right, things that most people would probably overlook. But when you love someone, your heart becomes finely tuned to their shifts, their absences, their new habits. One night, he came home with a faint scent that wasn't mine. Not my perfume, not any cologne we kept in the house. I noticed it the second he walked in. He kissed me on the forehead like always, and I smiled, said nothing, but my chest tightened. Another time, I picked up his jacket to wash it and found a movie ticket stub in the pocket. He had told me he'd been working late. Again, I said nothing, just quietly folded it back and tucked it away in the drawer, like if I ignored it long enough, it would rewrite itself. Then there were the messages, or rather, the lack of them. His phone became a fortress, turned upside down. When placed on the table, alerts turned off, a new password I didn't know. Once, I saw a message flash quickly before he locked the screen, just a name I didn't recognize and a heart emoji. He said it was a coworker. I nodded, said I believed him, but that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when I became someone who accepted half answers just to feel safe. But here's the truth. I wasn't afraid of a woman. I was afraid of being lied to by the man I had vowed to trust. That was what haunted me, not cheating, not betrayal, but the possibility that he had created a part of his life where I didn't exist. And still, I stayed silent. Why? Because it's easier to protect a version of your love than confront the reality that it might be slipping through your fingers. I began to question myself constantly. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I was projecting insecurities that had nothing to do with him. I told myself stories to fill the gaps. He's just stressed. He's distant because he's tired. He's not sharing because he wants to protect me. I built excuses like a wall around my heart, believing they would keep me from breaking. But walls keep everything out, even the truth. And that truth started knocking louder and louder. I began to feel invisible in my own marriage, like a ghost walking through the home we built together. I'd speak and he'd nod, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I'd ask him about his day, and he'd give me short, vague answers, never mean, never cold, just flat, emotionless, like he was saving his real feelings for someone else. There were days I caught him staring out the window for long stretches, lost in thought. I asked him once gently, what was on his mind? He smiled, said, nothing important, but something about the way he said it made me feel like the unimportant one. That's when it hit me. I was disappearing, slowly, not because he stopped loving me, at least, not in an obvious way, but because he was building a world I wasn't invited into. And I didn't know how to knock on the door of that world without losing him completely. So I did what I thought I had to do. I tried to become smaller, more agreeable, less confrontational. I stopped asking too many questions. I stopped suggesting weekend plans or date nights. I gave him space, thinking maybe he needed room to breathe. And once he did, he'd return to me. But space doesn't always heal. Sometimes it becomes a gap so wide, you can't even see the other side anymore. And that's where I found myself stuck, between suspicion and denial, holding pieces of evidence I didn't want to believe. And yet, I loved him. I loved him with a desperation I was ashamed of. I loved him with the hope that maybe I was wrong about everything, that maybe all the signs were coincidences, that maybe love was just changing shape, not disappearing. I remember one day, I broke down alone in our bathroom. I sat on the cold tile floor and cried quietly into a towel, terrified he might hear. I wasn't crying because I knew something. I was crying because I didn't know anything for sure. And uncertainty is its own form of torture. When you don't know whether to fight or surrender, whether to ask or stay silent, whether the person lying next to you is hiding a secret or just drifting through his own silent pain. The worst part was, I couldn't even be angry. I didn't have proof. I didn't have a confrontation. All I had was a growing distance and 1,000 unanswered questions. And still, I chose silence, because deep inside, I was waiting for him to choose honesty, for him to look me in the eyes and say something, anything that would either break me or set me free. I was waiting for the truth to come, not from a fight or a discovery, but from him, voluntarily, because I still believed that if there was something worth saving, he would show me. And one day, he did. But it wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was a key, a small quiet key that he placed in my hand with a look I'll never forget. And with it, only a few words. Words that still echo in my mind every time I think about the moment everything began to change. This explains everything. I didn't ask where the key led. I couldn't, not right away. When he handed it to me, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Vulnerability. Not the kind that pleads or begs, but the kind that quietly surrenders. Like he had finally run out of walls to hide behind. He didn't explain, didn't push. He just placed the key in my hand and said, "This explains everything," then walked away. That night, I held the key under my pillow like a fragile secret, not ready to use it, not ready for what it might unlock. My mind spiraled through possibilities, a second apartment, a box of memories, a truth I wasn't prepared for. I wanted answers, but I also feared them, because answers change things, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to see our life through a different lens. Days passed. I carried the key with me everywhere, in my bag, my pocket, even in my palm when I was alone. It was a quiet weight, pressing into my skin like a question. Every time I looked at him, I wondered if he knew how close I was to discovering something that could end us or maybe finally explain us. Then, one afternoon, when he was at work and the house felt too silent to bear, I got in the car and drove. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to follow the key. My hands trembled the whole way. The address had been scribbled on a folded piece of paper he'd tucked in the envelope. When I arrived, it was a small building on a quiet street I'd never been to before. I almost didn't go in, but something in me, maybe the part that still loved him, maybe the part that needed to heal, moved my feet. The key fit into a rusted silver lock on a plain wooden door. I turned it slowly, almost hoping it wouldn't work, but it clicked. The door opened, and nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. It wasn't a secret apartment. It wasn't a love nest or a hiding place. It was a studio, one room dimly lit, smelling faintly of old paper and worn leather. There were shelves filled with notebooks, dozens of them. On the walls, photos of us, candid ones I didn't know existed. Pictures from our wedding, our first trip, blurry selfies, notes I'd written to him and forgotten. In the center of the room, a desk with open pages scattered across it, his handwriting everywhere. It was raw, honest, unfiltered. I read page after page, and slowly, I started to understand. He wasn't hiding a person. He was hiding himself. These pages weren't lies. They were confessions, thoughts he hadn't dared to speak, memories he couldn't let go of, and pain he didn't want me to carry. One letter, folded neatly and placed on top of a worn journal, was addressed to me. I hesitated. Then I opened it. His words were shaky, like he wrote them on a day he didn't know how to keep breathing. He told me about the weight he'd been carrying, the guilt, the fear, the depression. He didn't understand. The shame of feeling broken while being loved completely. He said he'd made that place to feel safe while he figured out how to come back to me. "I didn't want to lose you," he wrote, but I didn't know how to explain the parts of me that felt like shadows. He hadn't been cheating. He hadn't been lying. He'd been fighting, quietly, alone. And maybe that was his mistake. Maybe it was mine too, for not asking harder sooner. But in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. Love is messy. It's layered. Sometimes it's not the absence of truth that hurts, it's the silence we wrap around it. I stayed in that room for hours. I cried. I laughed bitterly. I whispered to him even though he wasn't there. When I finally walked out, I wasn't the same. Something had cracked open in me. Something necessary. When I got home, he was in the kitchen, looking up like he had been holding his breath the entire time. I didn't say a word. I just walked over, placed my hand on his chest, and rested my head there. For the first time in what felt like forever, he held me without hesitation. without fear. That night, we talked, really talked, not about blame, not about what went wrong, but about the spaces between us, the parts we had both abandoned, and the pieces we still wanted to rebuild. I'm not here to say everything became perfect. It didn't. Healing isn't magic, it's work. But from that day forward, the silence changed. It became softer, shared, and that made all the difference. If you've listened this far, maybe you've felt that silence too. Maybe you're carrying your own unanswered questions. If this story touched something inside you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. It helps me keep sharing these parts of my heart. And if you feel safe enough, leave a comment or share this with someone who might need to hear they're not alone. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that save us. I kept thinking about that room. Even days after I left it, I would close my eyes and see the shelves, the journals, the way everything inside seemed frozen in time, like he had built a sanctuary no one else was ever supposed to find. I didn't tell him right away what I had read, not because I didn't want to, but because I was still learning how to carry it. His pain, his isolation, his silent battle. I read his words again and again. Some were short, almost cryptic. Others were long, detailed entries that painted a man I thought I knew, but clearly hadn't fully seen. He wrote about panic attacks that hit him while driving home, about nights he sat in that studio crying, unable to explain why, about the way he smiled at me across the dinner table while feeling like a stranger in his own skin. He never blamed me, not once. In fact, his guilt was almost unbearable to read. He kept writing that I deserved better, that he felt broken, that the more I loved him, the more terrified he became that one day I'd see through him and leave. I realized then that I had been living next to someone who was screaming internally while I was searching for evidence of betrayal, and it shattered something inside me, because all that time, I thought I wasn't enough for him. But in truth, he didn't feel like enough for me. That space, the studio, wasn't where he hid from me. It was where he tried to protect me from himself. And while I could finally understand his absence, it didn't erase the ache it had caused. There was no villain in our story, just two people hurting in ways neither of us knew how to name. I started noticing the little things differently after that. The way he'd hesitate before answering when I asked if he was okay. The long pauses, the unfinished sentences, the look in his eyes when he thought I wasn't watching. It was all there. I had just missed it because I was looking for something else, something more obvious, more dramatic. But pain isn't always loud. Sometimes it's hidden in routine, in quiet withdrawals, in smiles that don't reach the eyes. One night, I asked him if he ever thought about getting help, therapy. He looked at me with that same expression he wore when he gave me the key. Shame and hope tangled together. I tried, he said, a few sessions. It helped, but I didn't know how to bring it into us. I didn't want to be seen like that. Weak. That word weak stung, not because he said it, but because I knew how deeply he believed it. I told him what I'd read about the journals, the things he'd never said out loud. And for the first time in our marriage, I watched him crumble, not with anger or panic, but with surrender. He sat beside me on the floor, leaned his head against my shoulder and whispered, "I didn't want to lose the way you looked at me." And in that moment, I realized something simple and devastating. He thought my love was conditional, that if I saw all of him, the brokenness, the fear, the confusion, I would turn away. And maybe I would have once, before life softened me, before silence taught me that love isn't just built in joy, but in presence, in choosing to stay, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I held his face in my hands and told him something I should have said sooner. I don't need perfect. I need real. I need you. And he cried, not loudly, but the kind of quiet crying that comes from deep release. That night changed us, not magically, not completely, but it cracked something open. He started talking more, not always clearly, not always comfortably, but honestly. He told me about his childhood, about how he learned early on to survive by hiding what he felt, about the fear that if he showed weakness, he'd be abandoned. And suddenly, I understood the distance, the missed calls, the half answers, the locked phone. It wasn't about another person. It was about him not knowing how to let anyone, even me, all the way in. And I had to admit my own part in that. How often I filled the silence with assumptions instead of questions. How I let fear turn into judgment. How I stopped really seeing him because I was too busy protecting myself from pain. We both had armor on. His was silence. Mine was suspicion, and no one wins in that kind of war. But sitting across from him, hearing truths he'd buried for years, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long: connection. Not the romantic kind, not right away, but the human kind. Raw, honest, awake. We started making space for each other again. Not in grand gestures, but in the little things. Leaving the light on when one of us came home late, sending a text just to say, "I'm thinking about you," holding hands while watching TV, even if we didn't speak. And slowly, I began to see him not as the man I married, or the man I feared I'd lost, but as the man in front of me, flawed, real, trying. And maybe, just maybe, that was always enough. There's something quiet and sacred about learning how to love someone who doesn't know how to be fully seen. After everything I had discovered, his journals, his hidden room, the truths he had buried under silence, I found myself at a strange crossroads. Part of me wanted to move forward quickly, to forgive and rebuild and reclaim everything we had lost. But another part of me knew that rushing would only repeat the same mistakes. So instead, I chose presence. I chose to stay, not just physically, but emotionally. I sat with him in the spaces he once filled with distance, and it was hard. There were days he still shut down, days he would stare off, his fingers twitching with tension, his eyes unreadable. He would say, "I'm okay," and I'd look at him and softly reply, "You don't have to be." That became a quiet promise between us. He didn't have to perform wholeness anymore, and I didn't have to carry the silence alone. Loving someone who has learned to survive through hiding is not easy. There were moments I felt like I was learning a new language, one he had spoken his whole life, and I was only just beginning to understand. Every sigh, every pause, every change in his tone, I paid attention, not out of suspicion, but out of care. He, in turn, began to let me in, little by little, not in grand confessions, but in glimmers. He'd say, "Today was heavy," instead of "It's nothing," or he'd squeeze my hand twice while we walked our silent code for "I'm trying," and those tiny gestures felt bigger than any apology. I learned that healing isn't linear. Some days were light, filled with laughter and warmth. Other days, we'd drift, the air between us thick with old habits and unspoken fears. But we kept choosing each other. That choice, made over and over again, is what rebuilt us. I also had to confront parts of myself. I realized how much of our disconnection had come from my need for clarity, for answers, for emotional precision. But people don't always fit into the boxes we want them to. Love especially doesn't. It's messy, foggy, contradictory. It's sitting in a room with someone you adore and still feeling lonely. It's knowing they love you and still wishing they'd say it more often. I had spent so much time interpreting his distance as rejection, but now I knew it was fear, not of me, but of being unworthy, of being seen and still left behind. And I understood that fear more than I admitted, because deep down, I had been afraid too. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, asked too much, I'd break something that could never be repaired. So I had settled for fragments. But now, we were trying to gather those pieces, not to glue them back into what we were, but to build something new. One night, I asked him, "What scares you most about being loved?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, "That it'll go away once you really see me." I looked at him for a long time before answering. "But I do see you, and I'm still here." He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just held my hand like it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. And maybe it was. From that day on, he tried harder, not in dramatic ways, but he began to show up differently. He asked me how I was feeling. He listened without rushing to fix things. He apologized when he shut down. He even went back to therapy, this time not as something private and hidden, but as something we talked about openly. It wasn't perfect. We still had arguments. I still had moments of doubt, but there was honesty now. There was effort, and that changed everything. I used to believe love was about being chosen, once at the altar, in vows, in declarations. But now I see it differently. Love is about being chosen every day, especially on the days when we feel hardest to love, especially on the days when we don't even like ourselves. Watching him rebuild himself from the inside out, watching him face the parts of himself he had buried, made me love him in a deeper, quieter way. Not because he became who I wanted, but because he showed me who he really was. And in turn, I allowed myself to do the same. I stopped pretending to be endlessly strong. I told him when I felt tired, when I felt small, when I needed more. And, for the first time, he didn't pull away. He stepped in, and together, we began building something not based on who we had been, but on who we were willing to become. It's strange how love evolves when you stop performing and start being. It becomes softer, more honest, less afraid of imperfection. We stopped trying to be the perfect couple and started becoming real partners. We laughed more. We forgave faster. We listened with curiosity instead of defense. And when we failed, we returned not with guilt, but with grace. Some nights we'd lie in bed, our backs touching, not speaking and yet feeling closer than we had in years. Because closeness isn't always about words. Sometimes it's just the silence that no longer hurts. After everything we'd been through, the silences that cut deeper than words, the hidden pain that shaped our days, the slow unraveling of what I thought was unbreakable, I found myself standing at a new beginning. Not the kind of fresh start that erases the past, but the kind that holds every scar, every tear, every moment of doubt and hope as proof of survival and growth. Loving him after that key wasn't about forgetting or pretending. It was about embracing everything, all the darkness and the light, with open eyes and a fragile but determined heart. We learned to hold our vulnerabilities without shame, to ask for help even when it felt impossible, to sit in uncomfortable truths and still choose to stay. The road was never smooth. There were nights when the weight of the secrets he'd carried threatened to drown us both, when old fears and doubts whispered louder than our promises. But every time, we chose connection over silence, courage over retreat. I came to understand that love is not the absence of fear or pain, it's the willingness to move forward despite them. He showed me a strength I had never seen before, not the kind that demands or controls, but the quiet courage of a man facing his own darkness and still reaching out his hand to me. And I met him halfway, shedding my own armor of resentment and expectations. We rebuilt our trust not with grand gestures, but with the smallest acts of presence, a touch that said, "I'm here," a whispered, "I love you," a shared moment of silence that wasn't empty but full of meaning. It's in those fragile moments I found the deepest connection, the truest kind of love. I know now our story isn't unique. There are so many others living with invisible battles, silent struggles that reshape the love they thought they understood. To anyone listening who is walking that difficult path, whether you're the one hurting or the one trying to hold on, I want you to know, you are not alone. Your story matters. It deserves to be heard, to be held with compassion and understanding. If this story has touched you, if it's cracked open a part of your heart or helped you see your own pain with more kindness, please consider subscribing. It's one way we can keep these stories alive, reminders that love is complicated, imperfect, and deeply human. More than that, it's a way to build a community where real stories are shared, where healing can begin. And if you feel safe enough, I invite you to leave a comment. Share your own experience or your own truth. Every voice adds to the chorus of those who have suffered in silence, who have felt invisible and unheard. Together, we create a space where memories are preserved, where pain is given meaning, and where hope can grow. There are more stories like this waiting for you in the playlist. The link is in the description and pinned comments. I hope you stay, listen, and find comfort in knowing that even in the darkest moments, there's a path forward. Because love, in all its forms, with all its flaws and fragilities, is always worth fighting for. And so are you.